Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience with us. Can everybody hear us all right? Fantastic. So again, thank you for your patience and thank you for coming to this event on Palestine -1, which is also the last event of our Radical Book Fair this year. So for everyone who has attended this year, thank you so much. Yes, we're sad, but it's gone well, alhamdulillah. We're all good. Before we begin, I just want to say that if you did order a book, we now have the books. And so they will be available to buy at the end of the fair and just, yes, thank you. And we're really, really excited to have you here for this conversation. So I'm going to begin with introductions of our speakers and of the book itself, and then we'll launch into some questions and we'll have a discussion between us. However, 20 minutes before the event ends, I'm going to open up questions to you all. So if you have any burning questions, if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please do keep them in mind. We really want to hear from you. All right. So I'm going to begin by introducing furthest to the left, or to my left, Basma Ghalayini, the editor and translator who was born in Khan Yunis and raised in Gaza City. Her previous translations have been published by Commonwealth Writers, Deep Vellum Press, and Comma Press. She is editor of Palestine Plus 100, Stories from a Century After the Nakba, and Palestine -1, the focus of today's event. She is the series editor of Comma Press's Arabic titles. And we also have Mazen Maarouf, a Palestinian storyteller, poet, and translator. He worked in the scientific field for a period before moving into journalism. He has written on literature, art, theatre, and contemporary dance for a number of newspapers in Lebanon and the Arab world. He has published 3 collections of poetry and 3 collections of short stories, which have won prizes. The English edition of his short story collection, Jokes for the Gunman, was longlisted for the British Man Booker Prize in 2019. Can I get a round of applause for our writers, please? And the book that we're talking about today is it's ambitious, it's driven, and I should also say that this is an event that came to us through another organization, another festival in the city called Chimera. Yes, whoever did that, yes. Who are a stunning science fiction festival who come back every year. And so we are grateful for this partnership with Chimera and the way that the arts can work together. And I think the reason is fairly clear when we look at the premise of this book. How the book is about how literature can respond to a genocide, whether that's even possible. To quote the summary of the book, the contributors to Palestine -1 attempt to answer the question of can literature respond to a genocide, ignoring the idea that the history began in 2023 and addressing the great crime that underpins the entire occupation, the invasion and systematic annihilation of Palestine in 1948, displacing over 750,000 people and stealing 80% of their land, the event that is collectively remembered as the Nakba. Using literary devices typically associated with the horror genre, dreams, visions, ghosts, jinn, doppelgangers, and divided selves, these writers explore the lead-up to the 1948 Nakba and its aftermath, inviting readers to question the very realities that we, safe in the West, have built for ourselves. If the first casualty of war is the truth, the last is often the peace of mind of those who are invaded, a generational trauma in the case of Palestinians that haunt them in a language that fantasy and speculative fiction can certainly speak to. So I'm really, really grateful for our writers to have come here to be able to discuss this at a time where I think we are all trying to reckon with the genocide that we have and are continuing to witness, and as I think larger swathes of the world also understand that this is happening, finally have understood, and that we are also seeing genocides in other parts of the world that are gaining attention. So I'm actually going to ask Mazen, I'm going to delay our reading just for one moment, and I'm going to ask Basma if you can tell me a little bit about the thoughts and intentions behind Palestine -1, and just a little bit about how the thought came to you.
At the beginning of the genocide, as we all were, I was having to continue with my life as normal as if nothing was happening. Any Palestinian outside of Gaza would tell you that they had to painfully just continue. So I was driving back and forth to work, listening to Ilham Pape's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. I was listening to the audiobook because my brain couldn't process even reading at the time. And I find myself at each point in any Israeli onslaught onto Gaza, I find myself needing to educate myself because I know, now I need to prepare for the defense mode. As a Palestinian, you're going to have to start justifying your position, as you're always expected to do. So I was listening to this book just to educate myself a bit on the history, and anyone who's read this book will know Ilham Pape goes systematically through each village and how Plan Dalit and how the ethnic cleansing was applied to this village. And I thought it would be a good idea to send a call out to Palestinian writers to see if they would like to write a horror type of story about the village that they came from, a fiction story. And that was it, really. I thought it would be good. It would help in a way to the Palestinians outside of Gaza. We also need to process. We need to think. I thought it might be a way for us to process and write. And so the initial idea was that each writer would write something about a massacre that happened in their village or their grandparents' village in 1948. That was the initial brief anyway, and then, the rest is history.
The rest is a very compelling book. Mazen, this might be a good time to start that reading.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. Thank you for this invite. I'm honored and pleased. I'm going to read, I took part in this anthology, and I wrote a long short story titled A Chronicle of Granddad's Last Days Asleep. It's translated by Jonathan Wright into English. I wrote it in Arabic. The last thing we did in the village was wait for the body. What the smugglers told Granddad was that my father's legs had been cut off and they would bring him in a box because it was a long way. And that would protect him from the hyenas. Then I would help him attach his stumps to 2 pieces of wood and we would walk back home together. Granddad made the wooden legs out of 2 dry branches. As my father's father, he could estimate how much weight my father would have put on, even though he hadn't seen him for years. We waited for the body every day at noon. First Granddad and me, then me alone. Luckily, I wouldn't have to carry the pieces of wood by myself. I would put them on Azmi's back and wait on the limestone hills. Up there, the sun would fry my brain like an omelette. And since my father was going to come back in a box, I called him the corpse. Granddad liked the name, though, of course, it would last only till the moment the village saw my father walking alongside me. But the smugglers never arrived, and Grandma's view was that they had tricked us and my father had died fighting in the hills. So this is a paragraph of the first chapter of the story.
Thank you so much. So I think that's probably a good way to jump onto another question, which is, what is the place of fiction when we are trying to address something a horror that is real. And where do you as a writer and you as an editor, where do you find the space for fiction to address this?
Well, for me, I belong to the third generation of the Nakba. So my grandparents were kicked out of their homes in 1948. And we found ourselves, my father and my grandparents, refugees in Lebanon. And I was born in Lebanon as a Palestinian refugee. At that time, of course, like Palestine has always been in the oral storytelling, so in the camps in Lebanon, in the Palestinian camps, the story of the Nakba, the story of Palestine, the historical features of Palestine, the description of the villages, the description of everyday life never faded away. They were part of the Palestinian culture. They became part of your Palestinian identity, to tell stories and to listen to stories. So I think when also we did not have a lot of resources, visual resources of Palestine, because at that time we didn't have social media or access to, Facebook, there was nothing like that. So we only used our imagination to construct the country out of the storytelling itself. So it was like probably the first practice for me of building a place in a fictional way, And I think when it comes to Palestine, it's also very challenging because the reality is very harsh and very striking and powerful. So you have to really try to take what you want from the story of Palestine, from the cause of Palestine, and give it a literary entity when you write. You don't want to be a journalist. You don't want to be just copying, the event. You want to understand this reality further. You want to understand yourself, your identity as a Palestinian by writing a story like that. And of course, for me, it's very difficult to write. It's not. I'm very slow when I'm writing, and I think a lot, and because it requires that you should little bit detach yourself from your, identity in a way, to see things from some distance, and to have this balanced tone in your voice, because we are all, very upset now as Palestinians, and as everybody who feels they are human beings. We are very upset. We are angry. We feel this immense injustice applied on every one of us, on the Palestinians, on the pro-Palestinians. And I think this anger also could, sometimes block your literary, if I can call it, identity or entity, and this is very challenging. But for me, I was honored really to take part of this, because for the first time, Rapaj and Basma gave me the opportunity to build a story from the village of my grandparents, from my village, which is Deir el-Qasi, and which is one of the villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948. There is nobody living there. It turned into an Israeli settlement. The Hebrew name now is Al-Qush. But it's called Deir el-Qasi, and for me it was this great opportunity to honor the people of the village through writing this story.
Thank you so much. Basma, do you have anything?
I think for me personally, if anything, the genocide taught me anything. I already knew this, but the genocide made it a very stark reality, was how the media lies and how you can't really trust anything you see on the news. And in a sense, using fiction to talk about the Palestinian experience is truer, is more honest. You learn more about what Palestine's about and the Palestinian history is about by reading a fiction story, than you would watching the news. That's one thing about fiction and the way it operates in this context. So the second thing is, with regards to this book, we have a writer called Hassan Balasim. He's an Iraqi writer, and he wrote a couple of books, a few books actually. One of them called The Iraqi Christ, and he was being interviewed by a BBC journalist about now Hassan. Just to give a bit of background, he went through a really traumatic experience exiting Iraq, exiting the Saddam Hussein regime, and going through the mountains on his feet. He had a really traumatic exit from Iraq up until he eventually reached Europe and settled there. And then he wrote those short stories. And the BBC journalist asked him, she said, how do you write violence, and how do you write about violence in such a surreal way? And he kind of scoffed and said, well, anyone who experienced violence will know it feels very surreal and very like an out-of-body experience. And he thought the question was a bit ridiculous because, I mean, he thinks everything's, yeah. And these stories, a violent reality, a harsh reality, like Mazen said, like the Palestinian reality, the only way you can write about them sometimes to describe such a violent occupation, violent reality, the best way to write about them would be through speculative fiction because, like I said, anyone who experienced violence, it feels very trippy. And those, just looking back at it, it feels very surreal. So speculative fiction and fantasy and magical realism would be a good genre to describe the Palestinian experience, the violence involved in the occupation in that way. So I think that's how fiction in this sense served this book, yeah.
Thank you both. I think reflecting on what you've both said, you use fiction to respond, you use fiction to kind of to fill in the gaps in many ways, but also to kind of to be kind of that liberating or that kind of the force that allows for Palestinian presence, but also puts it firmly there. And I think I was really taken, Basma, in your introduction, you were writing about how the state of Israel also came out of a fiction, a fantasy, and it's dangerous. Fiction is dangerous at the same time, but fiction is also liberatory. It is reflective. It is potentially healing. And certainly this book is stunning for its response to horror. And I wondered whether the sense of where we use fiction almost flippantly sometimes when we talk about it, and I think this book illustrates kind of quite the opposite. And I wondered where the space for responsibility comes in for writers, for editors, when trying to contemplate alternative worlds or ways of responding to what has happened. Do you feel a sense of responsibility of this should be in? Like when you were writing about Esme, about the children, was there something that you kind of were drawn to in this story where you were like, this, I feel responsible for telling this particular story in this way? And the same when I was struck by, in your introduction, how you really contextualize everything. It was in the way that introductions have to, but maybe even beyond that, here is let me situate this book in history for you. And I've asked a very convoluted question, but essentially, where do you feel and respond to responsibility in fiction when perhaps reality has not served you right?
Well, I think, you cannot make fiction without from totally imaginable reality. I mean, we have to stick to some reality when we write fiction in general. But when it comes to Palestine, the responsibility here is moral responsibility. It's about the ethics of the cause, that we cannot manipulate facts, for example. Like there are some harsh facts that we cannot really alter or try to, go around or something. Especially when what happened in the past, it's just, it was happening again and again over time. Like for example, Gaza in the 60s was horrible place as well, to live under. It was under occupation. There was like a concentration camp also there. Nobody talks about it, but there are actually some articles by Israeli soldiers who were serving there as, soldiers in the 60s. And they were writing sometimes, things about their experience there. So what we are experiencing now is just another chapter in this long genocide. And even if you read about, for example, the Israeli intentions in the 70s, for example, toward the West Bank, which was like to evacuate the West Bank from the Palestinians, to expel all Palestinians, and to claim that, they just want to leave to Jordan, So the narrative hasn't changed. It's just like there is a different political situation. I think when it comes to responsibility, for me, it comes from I don't think about it as a responsibility. I think about it as I have to write something out of my belonging, my identity and my belonging to the village, to Deir al-Qasi, my village in Jalil, Galilee, which was turned into, Israeli kibbutz later settlement. So this is fiction here comes to stress on my belonging, to stress on my right that this is my land, this is my village, this is the village of my grandparents. My grandparents had homes, houses, lands, and suddenly they were expelled. And I think, I think the difficult part is like how to not lose your mind when you build a piece of fiction. For example, I remember when I wrote this story. First, I wrote a story and I sent it to Rapaj, and it took me maybe 4 months writing it. And I sent it to Ra, and I said, "This is the story. Please publish it." And I was relieved because I wrote it in Iceland, which makes it more, alienating for me to write under the snow or a snowstorm, whatever. So it's totally different reality there. There's nothing that would bring me to any visual reference, there. So then after I read the story again, I thought like, wow, this is garbage, So I wrote him, please, Ra, don't publish this story. I beg you, don't publish it. This is not the story. Then I had to rewrite it again in a way that I'm more satisfied with it. So I think when it comes to Palestine, as Basma said, it's a challenging place for fiction, but at the same time, it's not an easy, because it's so exposed, the cause of Palestine, the facts, and to make fiction out of it, yes, it requires responsibility, but it's not easy at all.
Yeah. I think for me, this book, I wouldn't say I felt responsible in that particular. I feel responsible as a Palestinian in other ways, but with this book, it was more a reaction to how it seemed like people just thought everything started on the 7th of October, and it obviously didn't. It started well before then. And what struck me most, what really was kind of the pivotal point for me in the thought process of thinking about this book was the Count Bernadotte story. When in the book, in Ilan Pape's book, he was talking about the assassination of Count Bernadotte by the Jewish gangs, by Stern and Lehi, and I thought, how have I never heard about this? How do I not? This is a man who helped evacuate or helped the release of Swedish Holocaust Jewish survivors, and he's now been placed in Palestine to work his UN magic, and then he gets assassinated by the Jewish gangs, and nobody talks about this. Nobody mentions this. Everyone associates. A lot of people think, Israelis needed a state because of the Holocaust. They had nowhere to go. The Jewish people had nowhere to go. It has nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's not even related. The Holocaust happened well after any of the concept of Herzl's concept of the Jewish state became. So for me, it was just a way I wanted a book that explained there was a massive build-up well before Nakba, well before 1948. There was, a lot of pieces moving, a lot of plans happening to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians well before the Holocaust, well before 1948. They're very slowly taking place, well before the 7th of October in 2023, and somehow everyone thought the 7th of October attack or whatever happened out of nowhere. That nobody ever questions, well, why did this take place? Why did a group of people decide they wanted to revolt or they wanted to resist? Nobody ever questions that. And that frustrates me. Yeah. So that's where the book came from.
Thank you so much. I think it makes so much sense what you're saying, and it feels like when you speak about fiction, I feel as though it kind of restores rights. It doesn't actually, but like it feels like it restores a sense of belonging, as you said, but a sense of restoring possibility as well, maybe, or restoring a story, the stories that should have been told, the ones that should have been real. And it made me think a lot about how what Palestinians have lost, but what the world has lost in times of the Nakba and in destruction and the facts of genocide, is that what it does is not just destroy but erase. And I think each of these stories is labeled with the village it is based in. And I think if when you pick up this book, I do encourage you to also go to the Palestinian Museum in Edinburgh, because there is a huge map on the floor of historical Palestine where you can go and you could take your book and you could look at every village that existed and that each of these stories responds to. For example, Deir el-Qasi, I believe, was very far in the north. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's close to the Lebanese borders. It's high. It's on the upper Galilee part, and actually it was very peaceful village. As all people lived. And my uncle told me, for example, that there was a village that was inhabited by Jewish settlers nearby, which is, by that time, because the Jewish immigration to Palestine took many different forms. And, there was, for example, the Jewish settlers who came from Russia, and, they were working in farms and things like that. But yes, it's one of these villages there. And actually, talking, just to comment on, follow up with what Basma said, I think in the beginning of the 20th century or the end of 19th century, the probably Herzl, if I'm not mistaken, sent a delegation to Palestine to check the land, and the answer, these two guys went there and they looked at the land, they looked at the country, and then they sent him a message saying that the bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man, which means there are Palestinian people there, and this is the land of Palestinians. This was, the message they sent. And just regarding the erase question, I grew up in Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon, and I grew up there, and I was a child when the invasion to Lebanon happened, 1982. And one of the first things the Israeli army did back then was to destroy the Palestinian archive. There was a Palestinian archive, historical, political, literary, and cinematic. And there was Markaz al-Abhath, which means the Center of Research, the Center of Palestinian Research, that was administrated by PLO back then, by, PLO like Yasser Arafat. And what the Israeli did was not only to fight the PLO in the streets of Beirut, but also to erase, to destroy this building. And they destroyed, for example, a huge archive from the cinema, the Palestinian cinema, back then, which was not only Palestinian, it was sometimes, like some European filmmakers who came to Lebanon and went to Palestine to document the life of Palestinian refugees in Palestine and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon as well, and Palestinian people in Palestine as well, and everywhere. So this is systematic. What we see now through YouTube, because we know now that Meta and YouTube, they are erasing. It's just a continuation to a policy that has been in the backbone of the Zionist thinking, which is not to only erase the people or try to erase the people, try to erase the memory, try to erase the archive, try to erase anything that would prove that I'm Palestinian. This is why we see some stupid narratives in the United States saying that there is nothing called Palestinians, literally coming from people who read nothing about history and who just want to be blind and want to be driven by their hatred and racism, and their support to Israel. But this is, if you go through the history from the Nakba till now, you see lots of things that Israel did to the Palestinians in Lebanon, in Palestine, that are exactly, maybe on a lesser scale of what's happening in Gaza, because, this is something unprecedented in history. But we are, as Palestinians, very familiar with these, familiar in a way, that this is part of our, why we continue struggling, why we continue to stress on our right to return, And one last thing, this is actually what annoys, the occupation, is that you can't find a single Palestinian anywhere in the world who gave up on their right to return. And this is something also very unique, that every Palestinian, whether they are in Latin America or United States or Europe or in the Middle East or Africa, they would tell you the same: we have the right to return, and this is our land.
Thank you. I think more to the archival thing, because you and I, we had this conversation, Mazen, last time. You told me about this. And when I did some research, and even the historical archives in the universities in Israel, the access to those has been all changed to online and limited to 20% access. So whatever archives, let's say, Elan Pape used to write his book, all of that's been limited now, and they don't even have, limited by the military, not. So there is a lot of, there's a lot of, coverage, censorship. Yeah, the archives of the Nakba, exactly. So, yeah, and
which, by the Israeli law, they should unveil this archive to the public after,
But because it's a military decision, then they can't really override that. So that goes to show for what Mazen said. So it's
actually Elan Pape talks about it. About he says literally that the archive that he uses, because he has the privilege to go through the archive there and use it and write these wonderful books. And he says that what he believes that the archive that is now, available is only 2% of the total archive, he says, this is what he says in one of his interviews. It's still very, very, very little, Sorry, you cannot expect to be in a Palestinian event without, being in this dramatic.
That's why we're here. There's no sorry. I think it feels very important to have that conversation, to have the conversation about the archives, because I think it brings into play what is lost, but also for me the importance of the fiction, the horror, the supernatural, the folklore, all of these being put back into play. And 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 10? Okay. 10 minutes until audience questions. Thinking caps on. So to return to the thought I was having of often, and maybe this is an ignorance on my part, but when I think about folklore, when I think about the supernatural when attached to place, when I think about those things, I think of it in the local. It might be the haunted house on the street that everybody knows about. It might be the jinn that inhabits the cage, or the cave rather. Those things that you know if you exist in that space, if you live round the corner. But some of the things that are written about in this anthology, and Mazen, I do feel like although life after death is not necessarily a horror, but the idea of ghosts, of children, of people who live past life, past their living time, and understand a future, I feel like it fits in. And I wondered basically if you both had thoughts on what it means for the supernatural, for things that often are about the local, to be represented on a global stage, for those things to kind of try to transmit truth on a global level, because what is happening in Palestine is globally relevant. And unfortunately, it feels like if we don't stop it, it could be globally multiplied. And so, yeah, just what are your thoughts on the supernatural and the horror in real politics?
I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but my thoughts, let's say especially with Mazen's story, Mazen, with Palestine plus 100, his story in Palestine plus 100, and his story in Palestine minus 1, the protagonists are children, or a child. And for me, I think in that kind of horror context or supernatural context, globally, it helps with fighting the dehumanization of Palestinians. The children are never mentioned, the women are never mentioned. It's always about the men or the resistance or it just gives a whole other level to how to perceive Palestine and Palestinians. I think it's a voice that's often overlooked and not addressed. I think that's really my take on that. Maybe I didn't answer your question quite right, but maybe Mazen will actually. Yeah.
No, I can add something actually, because the Palestinian archive, when it comes to storytelling, is mostly oral, and we rely a lot on the old people's stories in the camps. These old people, they sometimes carry the stories of the Nakba from a daily perspective, what happened to them day after day or hour after hour, as my parents do, like my uncles as well. They tell me how they walked from the ran away, how they ran away to Lebanon and so on. But also there is part of this Palestinian folklore that's related to supernatural powers actually, and recently, probably 5 years ago or something, 2 Palestinian researchers they collected all these folklore stories, and they published them in 3-volume books. It's really big collection. And when you go through, because I didn't read the whole thing, but I read some of the stories, because, in these stories, like the levels, like some stories are really good, others are less good, and so on. But you can see a lot of supernatural things that were believed, like any other, like the Grimm stories, for example, or. And so Palestine was not empty, empty of this kind of folk tales, but it needed only somebody to put this on. And I think when it comes to your question, because every time I think about the cause of Palestine, one word comes to my mind, which is unbelievable. It's like what happened is unbelievable. That people were living in peace in these villages, and suddenly other people came and kicked them out. And why? The question of why did this happened. I mean, we know why, but there is on the human level, you don't understand. You can't really easily understand how come somebody just expel another person like that and take over everything. But I think also that the Palestinian literature has been developed, over the past years very well, and especially after Oslo Accords in 1993. I think, because before that, Palestine was about, the Palestinian literature was a lot about resisting the occupation, about the right of return, but from collective point of view. The individual was not much given the space, you had to talk about the Palestinian people, you had to talk about, and after that, and after the Second Intifada, there was some kind of disappointment in the Palestinian writers, like a new generation especially, and they started to write, for example, in Palestine, poetry from the everyday life perspective, and literature from, the very personal sense of loss in a way which also extends, you can stick to the reality and write fiction and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Stunning. Like, wow, yes. I have a question that I'm kind of... we have a book that is set a year before the Nakba. We have a book that imagines Palestine in 100 years. Where in between, in the short term, in the next 50, like, what is the book that you want to write? What is the story that you want to write? Where will fiction take you? How will that happen?
This is a huge question, but I think...
You can have a minute if you need.
Yeah, it's like I will answer quickly, because it's amazing for us as Palestinians to see the world supporting us now. We have been screaming for this right for decades, and the world did not help us or really listen to us enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't have reached this, And the truth has been hidden, and if you talked about it, sometimes you are conspiracy theory guy or whatever, But now everything is unveiled, and which also bring us to a common question that this is not only about Palestine. It's about the threat that that is lurking before every one of us, because it's about the human rights. It's about humans. It's about respecting our dignity as human beings, and about not normalizing this kind of act, because this blend of technology and evilness, and capitalism, and it's very, very bad thing. And the way it's happening now, it's not going to stop in Gaza. The drones and things like that, the collecting data and things like that, it's not going to stop there. It's about every one of us. And I think the basic thing is that you learn from history that no occupation lasts forever, no matter what, And this is what we hope for, and this is what eventually will happen. Mm-hmm. That's it.
I agree with everything Mazen said. Just to give you a quick, simple answer, very, very specific, and I would like to see more children's books about Palestine. If we're talking about immediate kind of literature, it's not a grand answer. Yeah. Just a quick thought. That's all I can say on the matter, but I think Mazen covered everything else. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Can I get a bit more? Sorry? Just like
what are my hopes?
Children's books.
Oh, children's books?
Yeah.
Well, I've got 2 children, and they're half English, and I'm really, really struggling with the consequences of my actions by, being with an English guy now, seeing it through my children. And it would be very nice, and children's English books are a lot nicer than anything Arabic I've ever written. I just dream about a children's book about Gaza or about Palestine or about the villages. There are some out there. I mean, there's an example. It's a I for Intifada, or Alif for Intifada, and that's a bit extreme. But it would be nice. I'm desperate to talk to my children about. I mean, I went there with them to Gaza in 2022, and that was absolutely amazing. But it would be nice to just go to a bookshop and find a book about Palestine or about Gaza that they could just fiction, obviously, just the equivalent of whatever crazy stuff children's writers write. Yeah. It would be very nice. There are some out there, but it would be nice to have something Gaza specific. I know we're a publishing house.
The Book of Return, for example. The Book of Return could be. This is definitely what somebody's gonna write in the future. Maybe not the near future, but eventually this is what will happen. Let's say.
Amazing. Friends, I'm going to open the floor to audience questions. Do we have any burning questions at the moment? Oh, we do. Excellent. All right. I'm going to give Tunsi my microphone.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming and giving this talk. My question is kind of around narrative framing. So, quite often the narrative of Palestine, and especially of Gaza, is framed in the past tense. What can we do as readers of literary fiction to kind of shift that narrative, both within the literary world, but then also in our day-to-day conversations? Thanks.
How is it in the past? How is it phrased in the past tense? I did not quite understand. Did you understand it? Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, I quite often find that the way that Palestine is talked about in mainstream conversations focuses on either Palestinians as victims or Palestine as a place that had existed or does not have a certain future. How can we kind of shift that narrative as people who enjoy literary fiction?
Well, simply because, I think because this is a common mistake, I think, that's done on a global level when it comes to refugees everywhere. They are just looked upon as victims, not as human beings. And I think we should look at Palestinians as human beings who do mistakes, their rights stripped out of them, and who are, human beings that sometimes are looking for something in any human way, possible. But I think, when it comes to that also, the best way is to have a constant contact with the Palestinian literature. Because what we write, for example, is something that what we want to deliver, but at the same time the reader can pick up whatever they want. And I think now, there is this global conscience about Palestine, which allows this interaction between the readers and the writers and allows for a space of discussion and expanding ideas and suggesting, whatever. But, of course, Edward Said said that Palestinians are victims of the victims, But at the same time, we are human beings before anything else, And I think it should be looked upon us like that. We are human beings, Palestinians, not only victims.
Yeah, there is. I just a bit to add to that. It does grate on me that Palestinians sometimes are perceived as heroes who can do no wrong, and people are often surprised if they meet a Palestinian and they don't want to talk about politics and they don't want to talk about fighting the occupation and things like that. It's just, I think that's the flip side of the dehumanization of Palestinians. But I think the unfortunate thing about Palestinian history is we need to understand if you want to understand anything about the current genocide, you have to understand the past history of Palestine. So that forces us sometimes to look backwards and keep looking backwards, and till people understand what's happening now is just a knock-on effect on a bigger scale to what was happening throughout the last 7 decades or more. And so sometimes we are forced to keep looking back. It's not a decision, sometimes we don't have a choice about that at the moment, but maybe looking a bit to the future personally, it's a bit difficult to think about the future right now. But yeah, I think we need to look at the history to understand what's happening in the present, and maybe that's, yeah.
Any more questions in the room? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. It's been really enlightening. You talked a bit about this destruction of Palestinian archives, which we've seen both literally, in the physical destruction of physical places, and I think particularly in Gaza, the destruction of centres of education, of universities, of schools, and then also the, prolonged Israeli campaign of cultural erasure. I was wondering what you would say, what do you think these anthologies, so the Palestine -1, but also the +100 series and the Ramallah in short stories, are they a way of kind of reconstructing or documenting this archive and sort of preserving a collective memory, or are they creating a sort of something new? What do you think their kind of role is?
100%. That's what inspired. That's what made me think about this kind of concept, is because no one's talking about the history, and like Mazen said, we're getting less and less access to any archival material. It was just a way to remind people about what's been happening and what is happening, and the historical facts of the matter, if there is such a thing as historical facts, but and the timeline of events and the context of it all, because when you are as a people, you are being faced with erasure in a way, you are going to react by asserting your history and retelling it and re-emphasizing it. So yeah, definitely.
I want to say something that what's wonderful about Palestinian people now, I am, portraying Palestinians as absolute, the best, whatever. No, but what's wonderful is that every Palestinian has a story, has a story related not only to themselves now, but to their parents, their grandparents, and their relation to Palestine through centuries. So I think, and then when it comes to the story of being refugees as well, or staying in Palestine. Because, even in Palestine, there are refugees, Palestinian refugees, people who were, like Gaza, for example. The vast majority of people in Gaza were refugees from 1948, as we all know. But also you go, for example, sometimes to the northern Palestine, and you meet people who are stripped away from their villages and so on. And like that. And, so I think these books are something very, not because I wrote a story there, but they are really, really interesting, because for me, it connected me to writers, Palestinian writers abroad that, I hadn't read them before I read them here. And this also channels the Palestinian fiction in a more, knits the Palestinian fiction in a more, coherent way. But also, recently I met a friend who went to, I think, Chile, and he met a Palestinian woman there who was she was 80 years old or something. And she was child when she was kicked out, and she speaks a little Arabic, but she feels Palestine is her, is her country, not like where she grew up. And then she went back to Palestine as a visit and so on, So it's like you keep hearing stories about people very touching and very, very wonderful. And I think there is plenty of room for Palestinian fiction in that sense as well.
We have time for one more burning question.
Hi, I'm Charlie. My pronouns are they, them. Thank you so much for the talk, Free Palestine. I'm so grateful to hear about your experiences of gathering history through conversations and connection with your Palestinian ancestors. And Mazen, you talked about how your uncle imparted some history of his local areas to you in conversation. So it's not really a question, but I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the process of speaking with people who've lived in and loved Palestine and
tell you in more nostalgic way about Palestine, but when it comes to the everyday life of what happened, they could be a little bit hesitant because it's so striking and so traumatic, And my parents, for example, they lived in a camp in Lebanon, and this camp was totally demolished in 1975, the Zatar camp, which a massacre happened there, and the whole camp was like demolished and over. And then Sabra and Shatila and so on. So there is also in the Palestinian literary non-fiction, in a way, there is lots of traumas that are ongoing. So sometimes it's not easy to talk, to people. But for me, as a Palestinian who lives in Iceland, and sometimes I meet people and I say I'm Palestinian, and they say, "Oh, you're from Pakistan." I say like Palestine before. Now the genocide in Gaza, everybody knows where Palestine is. But for me, it was very, very interesting that my parents spoke about the horrors. They spoke very little. My mom was speaking much more than my dad. She would tell me stories about these fighters who had just 3 bullets in their guns or rifles, and they just wanted to fight and stay, and so on and so forth. So personally, I think part of my love to storytelling came from this early interaction, which was also driven by the sense of discrimination in Lebanon, because as Palestinian, Palestinians as refugees, they don't have very good life. Not good at all, in the Arab countries as well. They are stripped of their rights and they struggle a lot. And these regimes also keep telling us that, we should strip you of your rights, because if we give you the full rights, you will forget about Palestine. So we want you to be poor, miserable, you cannot do this job or that, so that you run away to Palestine, So there are lots of dimensions there. But for me, and for any Palestinian, of course, it's very, very important to trace these stories and document them and use them as material for fiction and non-fiction, for the sake of keeping the identity and the memory alive, because we are under big, big threat in terms of the massive level of the Israeli, capability, what they are capable of doing, let's say. So fiction serves as this silent, beautiful weapon of aesthetics, weapon of connecting people together, weapon of learning how to raise the voice and how to connect to our, belonging, because I think we all belong, we all feel Palestinians now, not only me as a Palestinian, many people around the world, they feel Palestinians because Palestine became a symbol of lots of things, not only piece of land, or matter of identity or something. I hope I answered, I talk too much.
Do we have time? If you can keep it quite short, then.
To be honest, in terms of stories about Gaza, I'm personally still really struggling to. For example, my mum's in Manchester. She came at the beginning of the genocide, and we both really struggled to talk about. We're very practical in our discussion about Palestine, because about Gaza at the moment. I struggle to talk about it. She struggles to talk about it because it's ongoing, and we're seeing people we love being killed. I'm seeing, places I grew up in and spent time in being demolished and bombed. So it is at this point, it's very, very difficult. I know what Mazen said is we need to be collecting, diaries, and I want to sit with my mum and write down everything she knows, but it's just so difficult. It's something I need to do. but it's not easy at all. I wish I could do it, but I really struggle with it. So, yeah, that's all I can say on the matter.
Thank you so much. Thank
you.
We are going to end here. Ending here doesn't mean, obviously, that we really end these stories. And I think that these books, our writers, our editors, the people that we have on this stage, are testament to the fact that we have desire for these things to continue, and that there are very practical actions that we can take. So there are solidarity societies, there are actions to protest outside of arms factories, there are political actions that we all can and should take. And so I do hope that this has restored a sense, or not restored, but you can look to the people in the seats next to you and you can see the people who are your comrades in these actions, and you can make those connections. And that when we come here next year, inshallah, things will be very different and much better. And until then, and even if it's not next year, we continue doing that. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this event, to this fair. Could you give my writers a round of applause? If you wouldn't mind staying in your seats for 2 minutes, we're going to leave the stage and go that way, and the writers will be ready to sign your books. The fair is closing today, so this is your last chance to take a look at the fair, to meet people, to ask questions, and to form those connections. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you can start making your way up. Just a reminder, the books have arrived, and they are at the till. Other books published by Comma Press are just on the piano, and the signing table is there. We also have a pay-it-forward system, so if you're too broke for a book, somebody has put money in the pot for you. Anyone who wants a book can take a book home.